I knew the moment my son looked at me with that quick, embarrassed half-smile that something inside the evening had already shifted. That fragile balance between mother and son tilting toward a place I had never imagined I'd have to stand. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, a quiet celebration of his promotion. Nothing extravagant, nothing complicated. And yet the quietest moments have a way of revealing the things we've tried hardest not to see. I arrived early as I always did, wanting to help, wanting to feel useful, wanting to be part of the small rituals that once defined my place in his life. The table was set beautifully, every plate and glass arranged with the kind of detail that used to be my signature, but now it belonged to someone else. His wife's mother stood across the room, adjusting a napkin with a confidence that announced her comfort, her ownership, her unspoken understanding that she belonged here in a way I no longer did. I told myself I was imagining the tension, that my son's hesitation when he greeted me was nothing more than distraction. He hugged me. Yes, but his arms didn't linger the way they used to when he was younger, when my embrace was the only place he softened. He pulled back too quickly, glancing over my shoulder as if checking whether anyone was watching. I pretended not to notice because pretending had become a quiet habit, a shield I wore to keep from feeling the sting of being displaced. It's strange how invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It settles slowly, like dust, soft at first, almost gentle, until suddenly you're buried beneath it, wondering when you disappeared. We sat down for dinner and I instinctively moved toward the seat next to him, the one where I had always sat. The one he saved for me through school ceremonies, birthdays, late-night meals, the 1,000 small moments that shaped our bond. But tonight, before I even reached it, my son stepped forward and placed his hand lightly on my arm. His voice was warm, practiced, careful, the way people speak when their words have been rehearsed. "Mom," he said softly, "don't make it awkward." The room seemed to still around me as he pulled the chair back, my chair, and offered it to his wife's mother with a smile that felt too bright, too eager, too proud of his own politeness. She accepted it without hesitation, lowering herself into the spot I had unconsciously believed would always be mine. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. My body moved, but everything inside me sagged like something collapsing quietly in the dark. I found another seat, one further away from him, further from the warmth I once assumed was permanent. I felt the shift in the air, the subtle tightening of my chest, the heaviness that comes when a part of your identity slips out of your hands without warning. I wondered who else had noticed. Probably no one. The world rarely pauses for a mother's heartbreak. I tried to focus on the food, on the conversation floating around the table. I smiled when appropriate, nodded when spoken to, played my role with the kind of practiced grace women my age wear like second skin. But underneath the surface, something sharp was twisting. A quiet voice whispering that I had stepped into a new chapter I never agreed to write. A chapter where my son's loyalty no longer anchored itself to me, but stretched toward new alliances, new expectations, new performances of adulthood that left little room for the woman who once shaped him. Halfway through the meal, I realized my silence was becoming too loud. I forced myself to speak, to share a story from earlier that week. Something light, something meant to blend seamlessly into the evening. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt an old ache rising in my throat, a longing for connection, for reassurance, for some tiny sign that I still mattered to him. And maybe you, listening to this now, have felt something similar. That sudden shift when a role you thought was permanent begins to crumble. If you have, tell me. From where in the world are you watching this? Because sometimes the only comfort is knowing that someone out there understands this quiet unraveling. As the conversation continued, I found myself studying my son's face, searching for traces of the boy who used to cling to my hand, who used to run to me first with his triumphs and his wounds. I saw glimpses of him, but faint ones, faded outlines beneath the confident man he had become, a man shaped by new commitments and new expectations. I wasn't jealous of his wife or her mother. Jealousy wasn't the right word. It was more like mourning. Mourning the version of myself that once mattered more than anyone else in his world. Mourning the simplicity of a love that once had no rivals. At one point, he leaned over to refill his mother-in-law's glass, a gesture small enough to be insignificant but large enough to press on the bruise already forming inside me. She laughed at something he said, touching his arm lightly, and he beamed, pride illuminating his face. I remembered when that expression was reserved for me, when my approval was the sun he chased. Tonight, that light belonged elsewhere. The evening stretched on, its edges soft but heavy, like a fog settling over a landscape you once knew by heart. I felt myself drifting to the margins, not pushed there intentionally, but carried by the quiet currents of change. I wondered if he noticed. I wondered if he cared. And maybe that's the heaviest truth of all. Not the moment he gave away my seat, but the realization that he didn't see it as giving anything away. To him it was nothing, a gesture of courtesy, of adulthood, of alliance with the life he was building. To me, it was the faint sound of a door closing, gently, almost lovingly, yet irrevocably. By the time dessert arrived, I had become adept at hiding the storm inside me. Decades of being a woman, a mother, someone who holds the fragile pieces together while breaking quietly in private, had taught me well. I laughed when expected, participated when necessary, all while something deep inside me began reshaping itself, hardening in some places, softening in others, forming a new version of myself around the hollow left behind. And maybe, as you sit with me in this moment, you can feel the same shadow stretching across your own memories, the slow, unspoken shift between mother and child, between being needed and being politely dismissed. If you've ever stood on that invisible border, you know how cold it can feel. As the plates were cleared and the evening wound down, I realized something quietly devastating. My son had no idea the small exile he had placed me in. He hadn't meant harm. He hadn't meant to wound. He had simply grown. And somehow, in that growth, I had become an afterthought. Before I continue, let me gently ask you to stay close to this story. If you're feeling the weight of these moments the way I lived them, make sure you subscribe so you don't lose the pieces that come next, because they only grow deeper, sharper, and more revealing. That night, when I got home, I sat in the quiet darkness of my living room for a long time, the air heavy with the faint scent of the perfume I'd worn to the dinner. It lingered on my scarf, soft and floral, but all I could think about was how no one had noticed it. I used to remember my son's little voice saying, "Mom, you smell like home." Funny, isn't it? How something that once brought comfort can turn into a ghost that haunts you when no one is left to recognize it. The silence in my house wasn't new, but that night it felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Every tick of the clock reminded me that I was now the visitor in his story, not the author. I replayed the moment, his hand on my arm, the way he said, "Don't make it awkward, Mom." That sentence echoed in my head, replaying like a bad melody you can't turn off. It wasn't cruel. He didn't say it with anger or disdain. It was almost tender, protective even, but that's what made it worse. He was protecting her feelings, not mine. I was the one who had to carry the discomfort silently, smiling through the ache so no one would feel sorry for me. That's the strange thing about motherhood. Your suffering is always meant to be invisible, wrapped in understanding, disguised as grace. The next morning, I tried to distract myself. I made tea, opened the curtains, told myself that it was just one dinner, one small shift in the long journey of motherhood. But as I sipped from my favorite cup, I caught sight of a photo on the shelf. Him as a boy, sitting on my lap, his tiny hands gripping my face like I was the only world he knew. My heart clenched. That photo had been taken on his first day of school. He had been nervous, and I'd promised him that no matter what, I'd always be there. And I was. Every fever, every heartbreak, every uncertain step toward adulthood, I was the constant. Until constancy became inconvenient. Days passed, and I told myself to let it go, to not dwell. But memories have their own will, and mine began to surface at unexpected moments, like the time he called me late at night just to talk because he couldn't sleep after failing his first college exam. Or the night he cried when he moved out, promising that nothing between us would change. How easily those promises fade under the weight of time and new priorities. I didn't blame his wife. She was kind, attentive, everything a mother could hope for in someone who loved her son. But her mother, she was a presence that filled every space I used to occupy. She wasn't cruel, not at all. But she didn't have to be. Her comfort in his world was enough to remind me that mine was diminishing. I started noticing the small things, the missed calls, the shorter visits, the texts that ended with, "I'll call you later," and never came. Love doesn't vanish overnight. It thins out, stretching across new lives until it becomes translucent. And when you finally see through it, it hurts in a way words can't fully describe. I told myself I had to adapt, to let him build his life without my shadow hanging over it. But letting go feels nothing like they promise it will. It's not graceful. It's not peaceful. It's a slow, internal tearing that happens behind polite smiles and nods of approval. One afternoon, about a week later, he stopped by my house. I wasn't expecting him. My heart lifted for a moment, stupidly hopeful, like an old reflex. He brought some groceries, said he thought I could use a few things. He looked good, confident, happy, like a man who belonged in his own story now. I offered him coffee, and he accepted, sitting at the table I'd kept the same since he was a boy. The same chipped edge, the same chair that squeaked when he leaned back. For a few minutes, we talked like we used to. About work, about life, about nothing and everything. But I felt it coming. The unspoken distance that kept threading itself between us, weaving a quiet wall of politeness. At one point, I asked him gently if everything was okay. He smiled, said, "Of course, Mom. Why wouldn't it be?" And maybe that was my answer, because he truly didn't see it. The shift, the distance, the slow erasure of something sacred. It wasn't intentional. It was life moving forward. But I sat there, listening to him talk about plans, about his wife's family coming to visit again soon, about how it just makes sense to spend holidays together with them this year since they have more space. I nodded. I smiled. I said it sounded perfect. Inside, I could feel my chest tighten, like something small and essential had cracked just enough to let the cold in. When he left, I stood by the window watching his car pull away. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against me like a living thing. I wondered when love stopped being enough to keep you close to someone. I wondered if he would ever notice the absence of my chair at his table, the warmth that used to anchor him quietly in the background. But deep down I knew he wouldn't, not yet. Maybe one day, when he has a child of his own, when that child grows and pulls away in the same subtle, careless way, he'll understand. That night, I sat at the same table where he'd just been, the air still holding traces of his cologne, faint and fleeting. I realized that motherhood isn't just about nurturing. It's about learning to fade gracefully, to become the silence that still holds everything together even when no one sees it. I thought about calling him, just to say goodnight like I used to, but I stopped myself. He was probably busy, and I didn't want to be awkward. If you're still here, still listening to my story, it means something inside you understands this quiet heartbreak too. Stay with me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part, because the moment that follows, the one where everything changes again, was the night I finally realized how deep the distance had grown. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore, it became physical, something you could measure in the way our lives stopped overlapping. Weeks turned into months, and I learned to live in the small echoes of his voice that came through quick phone calls and polite messages. I convinced myself it was enough. But deep down, I could feel the emptiness blooming quietly, like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Every room in my house held a memory of him, his laughter, his footsteps, the soft slam of his bedroom door when he was 16 and angry at the world. Those sounds had once filled this home with life. Now, the silence felt like an accusation. It was a Sunday afternoon when he called. His voice sounded hurried, distracted, like he was calling out of obligation rather than desire. He told me they were hosting another dinner, his wife's parents, a few friends, some colleagues, and wanted to see if I was free. It should have felt like an invitation, but there was something in his tone that told me otherwise. I hesitated, almost said no, but the thought of him wanting me there, even if out of duty, pulled me back into hope. I said yes, and that yes, that tiny word, would become another quiet wound. When I arrived that evening, the air already carried the hum of laughter and conversation. His home was beautiful, warm lights, soft music, the scent of food that filled every corner. It was the kind of home I'd dreamed of him having one day. I stood by the door for a moment before stepping in, adjusting my coat, trying to blend in. His wife greeted me warmly, as always, her politeness wrapped in genuine effort. But again, I saw her mother already there, sitting comfortably in my place, by his side, at the heart of his world. The sight didn't sting this time. It numbed. I smiled, walked over to the far end of the table, and found a chair at the edge, unnoticed, unclaimed, the kind of space reserved for polite guests rather than family. Throughout dinner, I watched him. His gestures, his laughter, the way he looked at his wife with love. It was beautiful and painful, and I didn't know which emotion to hold on to. I tried to participate in the conversation, but every time I spoke, it felt like my words floated somewhere above the table, disconnected, unanchored. They laughed at each other's jokes, exchanged knowing glances, shared stories I wasn't part of. I realized that I was no longer part of his everyday language. I had become a past tense, someone he referred to, not someone he included. Halfway through the evening, his wife's mother mentioned something about their upcoming trip. "It'll be wonderful," she said, turning to me with a polite smile. "We'll send you pictures, of course." "Will." The word hit me like a sudden chill. I didn't even know they were traveling. My son looked momentarily guilty, his eyes darting away before he explained they'd just finalized the plans last week. I nodded, pretending it didn't matter, pretending the realization hadn't cracked something inside me. I smiled so tightly my cheeks ached. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who love each other. It's not loud or desperate. It's quiet, suffocating, almost dignified. You sit there, invisible, wearing your best smile, while the warmth you once owned belongs to someone else. I excused myself after dinner, claiming I wasn't feeling well. My son walked me to the door, and for a brief second, I saw the boy he used to be in his eyes, the flicker of concern, the hesitation, the pull between two worlds. "You okay, Mom?" he asked softly. I nodded, the lie smooth and practiced. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." He hugged me, and for the first time I noticed the difference in that embrace. It was gentle but distant, as if he was afraid to hold me too tightly, afraid to make things heavier than they already were. I whispered, "Take care," and stepped into the cold night. The wind caught my scarf, brushing it against my face like a reminder of everything I'd lost but still carried. On the way home, the streets were quiet, almost cinematic in their stillness. I remember looking through the car window, watching the lights blur into gold and white streaks. I wondered when exactly motherhood turns into memory, when the living, breathing connection becomes a photograph on a shelf, a phone call scheduled between meetings. I didn't cry that night, The tears had dried somewhere along the way, replaced by a dull ache that felt too familiar. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked strong, composed, but her eyes gave her away. They carried the exhaustion of decades spent giving, holding, forgiving. And yet, beneath all of that, there was something new. Acceptance. A quiet, fragile kind of peace. I realized I could either keep trying to reclaim a seat that was no longer mine, or I could learn to build a new table, one where I no longer had to wait for someone else to make room for me. That realization didn't heal me instantly. It never does. But it gave me breath. I started small. I went out for walks, met old friends, began volunteering at a local shelter. I filled my days with small acts of kindness, not for others, but for myself. Each one was a piece of me returning, slowly, cautiously. My son still called occasionally, his voice warm but hurried. I answered every time, not because I was waiting, but because I wanted to. Because love, even when it changes, doesn't have to disappear. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that dinner, about the seat that once belonged to me. I wonder if he ever notices, in some quiet moment, the echo of my presence beside him. Maybe one day he will. Maybe not. But I've learned that motherhood is not about holding on. It's about loving enough to let go, even when it breaks you. And if you're still listening, still feeling this story in your chest, don't go yet. Subscribe, because the last part is where I tell you what happened the day he finally saw me. Not as the mother who raised him, but as the woman he had almost forgotten existed. It was a gray morning, the kind that seems to hum softly with something unspoken, a kind of melancholy that lingers between the clouds. I was standing in my kitchen, the kettle beginning to sing, when the phone rang. His name flashed across the screen. It startled me, not because it was unusual, but because lately our calls had become routine, predictable. But this one felt different. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe mothers never really lose that invisible thread connecting them to their children. His voice was quieter than usual. "Mom," he said, hesitating. "Can I come over for a bit?" I told him, of course, my words coming out steadier than I felt. When I hung up, I stared at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't rush to fix my hair or change my clothes. For once, I wanted to meet him exactly as I was, not as the mother who always made things easy, but as a woman who had lived, waited, and learned how to exist in the quiet space between love and letting go. When he arrived, he looked different. Not physically. He was the same tall man with his father's eyes and my smile. But his face carried something I hadn't seen in years. Hesitation. He stood at the door like a boy again, holding something fragile in his hands. A small box. "I brought you something," he said softly, stepping inside. He smelled faintly of rain and cologne, a combination that brought back memories I thought I'd buried. We sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken things. He looked around slowly, as if rediscovering the space that had once shaped him, the same walls that had heard his laughter, his crying, his first words, his first lies. "It feels smaller," he murmured, almost to himself. "Or maybe I just remember it bigger." I smiled gently. "You grew, that's all." He nodded, his eyes falling to the box in his lap. "Mom, I wanted to tell you something," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about that night. The dinner." My chest tightened. Even after all the time that had passed, the memory still had sharp edges. He exhaled, rubbing his hands together nervously. "You looked so quiet that night." I didn't notice then. But afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the seat, about what I said. I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to keep things easy. I didn't realize what I was really doing. I stayed silent, my hands wrapped around my mug, grounding myself in its warmth. He continued. The truth is, I've been acting like you're unshakable, like you'll always understand. And I guess that made me take you for granted." His eyes lifted to meet mine, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once looked at me like I was his whole world. He opened the box. Inside was a simple frame, silver-edged, holding an old photograph. The two of us at his graduation, his arm around my shoulder, both of us laughing. I remembered that day. The sun had been too bright, the air too full of joy to notice the shadows that would come later. He handed it to me, his fingers trembling slightly. "I wanted you to have this back," he said. "I found it in one of our storage boxes. I realized I'd been keeping it without even meaning to. I thought, maybe it should be where it belongs." Something in me broke, not with pain this time, but with a quiet kind of release. I smiled, but my eyes burned. "It's always belonged to both of us," I said softly. He leaned forward then, his hand finding mine across the small space between us. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, "for that night. For every time I made you feel like you didn't belong. You always will." I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I understood, that this was how life unfolded, that children grow, and mothers fade, and love reshapes itself into something quieter, wiser. But I didn't. Instead, I held his hand a little tighter and said, "Thank you for seeing me." Because that was what I needed most. Not his apology, but his acknowledgement that I was still here. We spent the rest of that afternoon talking, not about the past, not about regret, but about small things. The weather, the books we were reading, his plans, my garden. It was simple, unremarkable, and yet it felt like something sacred had been restored. Not the old closeness, it would never be exactly the same, but a new kind of bond, one built on understanding rather than need. When he left, he hugged me longer this time, and when he pulled away, I saw a softness in his eyes that told me he finally understood. The way love evolves, the way it requires distance and forgiveness, the way it never really disappears. After he drove off, I sat on the porch, the framed photo in my lap, the evening light stretching across the sky like a quiet blessing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider in his story. I was simply part of it again. Different, smaller maybe, but still real. As I watched the day fade, I thought about how life moves in cycles, how we give everything we have, sometimes to the point of emptiness, only to find ourselves again in the stillness that follows. And maybe that's the secret no one tells you about motherhood. It's not just about holding on to your children. It's about holding on to yourself when they no longer need you the same way. If you've listened this far, if you've felt a piece of your own heart reflected in mine, don't forget to stay with me. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your story in the comments. Tell me, have you ever felt the quiet ache of being seen again, just when you thought you were forgotten? Because somewhere between the silence and the remembering, that's where we mothers truly live.